There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. You don't see them coming. You never do. They don't announce themselves with thunder or flashing lights. They arrive quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of you just trying to get from point A to point B without losing feeling in your fingers. That's how it started for Nadia Voss. She wasn't looking for anything unusual. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She was 17 years old, living in a world that had already made her feel small enough, and she was just walking home from her shift at the atmospheric filtration depot on the edge of Sector 9. That was it. That was the whole plan. But then she saw the bird. Let me back up a little, because context matters here. You need to understand what kind of world Nadia was living in before you can understand what she did, and why it changed absolutely everything. The year is 2287. Earth isn't what it used to be. I know people always say that about whatever era they're living in, but in this case, it's literally, measurably, scientifically documented. Earth had its first contact event in 2201, what historians now call the threshold opening, when a galactic consortium vessel made atmospheric entry over the Arctic and didn't leave. That was 86 years ago. 3 generations of humans have now grown up in a world where the sky isn't just ours anymore. The cities adapted, or some of them did. New Reykjavik, where Nadia lived, was one of the adaptive ones, a sprawling mixed habitation zone built partly underground and partly up into reinforced above-ground towers that could withstand the consortium's weather stabilization fields. The fields were supposed to be a gift. They were sold to the human governing councils as environmental regulation technology, a way to prevent the worst effects of climate destabilization. What they actually did was make winter in Sector 9 last 11 months of the year. Nobody wanted to say that out loud too clearly, because the consortium representatives had listening posts everywhere, and complaining about their benevolent infrastructure contributions was the kind of thing that got your residential permit reviewed. But everyone knew. You could see it in the way old people move through the cold, with a stiff bitterness, not just of the body but of something deeper, something that remembered a different sky. Nadia had never known that different sky. She'd been born in 2270, which meant she was pure post-contact generation. The consortium towers were just part of the skyline to her. The checkpoint grids at every sector boundary were just something you passed through with your ID chip held up. The galactic soldier patrols, tall, 8-limbed, wearing that matte dark atmosphere armor that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, were just something you learned to walk around without making eye contact. Her mother had drilled that into her since she could walk. Don't stare at the galactic soldiers. Don't ask them questions. Don't draw attention. Be invisible if you can, polite if you must, and never, ever do anything that looks like defiance. Nadia had followed those rules her whole life. Until the bird. It was a Tuesday, February, or what passed for February in the stabilized climate zone, which meant the temperature was sitting at -14, and the snow was coming down in those heavy, wet sheets that don't look dramatic but accumulate faster than you'd think. The kind of snow that turns streets into wading pools of slush and then freezes over by morning. Nadia was walking the long way home from the depot. The short way took you past Consortium Checkpoint 7, and the soldiers there had been running extended ID sweeps all week, something about a territorial compliance review, which was the polished bureaucratic language for, we're looking for someone, and we're going to inconvenience every human in the sector until we find them. The long way added 20 minutes to her walk, but let her come in through the residential access tunnels instead, which only had automated scanners and no actual soldiers. She had her head down, collar up. The depot-issued thermal jacket was good but not great. It kept the wind off but didn't do much for the radiating cold coming up through the street plates. She was thinking about the temperature in the apartment, whether her building's heat exchange units were running or whether they'd been throttled again, and whether she had enough synthetic broth packets to make something warm for dinner. She was not thinking about ravens. The bird was lying at the base of a street lamp about halfway down Meridian Passage, one of those narrow service corridors between the residential towers that the planners had optimistically paved with heated tiles back in the 2250s, before the heating grid started failing sector by sector. The tiles in Meridian Passage hadn't worked for 3 years. The snow had packed into every crack and joint between them, white and glittering under the blue-white of the lamp. Nadia almost stepped on it. She didn't because her foot came down at an angle and the thing moved just barely, just a twitch of one wing that sent a small flurry of snow crystals up. And she stumbled sideways, heart slamming into her ribs, hand slapping the lamp post. What the? She caught herself, leaned in, squinting through the snow. A raven. A massive one, actually. Bigger than any raven she'd ever seen, though she'd only really seen them through glass, at the old Natural Remnant Conservation exhibit in the Sector 3 Museum. This one had a wingspan, even folded, that looked like it should belong to something larger. Pure black, not the blue-black iridescence you saw in pictures, but a deeper, stranger black, like light went into its feathers and didn't entirely come back out. One wing was extended at an angle that was clearly wrong. Not broken. She'd find out later that it wasn't broken, but dislocated, pressed against the pavement by the weight of accumulated snow and something else, something she couldn't see yet in the dim light. Its eye was open. That was the thing that stopped her from just walking around it and continuing on her way. The eye was open and looking at her, not the blank, glazed look of an animal near death, focused, aware, watching her with an intelligence that sat somewhere behind the amber iris and made her feel, inexplicably, like she was being evaluated. She stood there for a moment in the middle of the snow, 17 years old, cold, tired, and deeply unsure of what to do. The sensible thing, the thing her mother would have said, was to keep walking. A bird was a bird. In the post-contact world, animal welfare infrastructure had been the first thing to go when the consortium started redirecting municipal resource allocations. There were no animal rescue services in Sector 9. There was barely a human medical clinic, and that one operated on a 16-day appointment waitlist. A bird in the snow was a bird in the snow, and getting involved in something that wasn't your problem was how you ended up making it your problem. Nadia crouched down. She did it before she'd consciously decided to. Her knees hit the cold tiles and she was at eye level with the raven, looking at it from about 2 feet away, and it looked back at her without flinching. Snow was settling on its back, on its good wing, on the edge of its slightly open beak. She could see the breath coming off it, tiny wisps of warmth in the freezing air, still alive, definitely still alive. Okay, she said quietly to the bird, to herself, to no one in particular. Okay. She unzipped her jacket. I want to be clear about how significant that was, because in Sector 9 in February, unzipping your thermal jacket is not a casual gesture. That jacket was standing between Nadia and a real hypothermia risk. She knew that. She'd grown up knowing that. But she took the bird, carefully, slowly, using both hands and making herself stay calm when it clicked its beak at her in warning, and she tucked it against her body, under the jacket, zipping it back up so only the bird's head was visible above the fastener. The raven went still almost immediately. She felt it against her ribs, the surprising weight of it, the warmth it still carried despite everything, the rapid, shallow rhythm of its breathing. She walked home faster than she'd ever walked that route before. The apartment was on the 6th floor of residential block 14C, unit 602. She'd lived there her whole life. Her mother had gotten the residential permit through the depot, which was one of the few human-operated facilities the consortium allowed to use non-standard allocation housing. It was small, 2 rooms plus a sealed utility alcove. The windows were the old-style triple-pane vacuum glass, fogged at the corners where the seals had degraded, and the wall opposite the entrance was marked with a series of pencil lines from when Nadia was small, and her mother used to measure her height every birthday. Her mother wasn't home. Late shift at the depot, wouldn't be back until past midnight. Nadia had the place to herself. She set the Raven down on the kitchen worktop, on top of a folded cloth that had been a dish towel in a previous life, and stepped back to get a proper look at it. In the light, it was even more striking. The blackness of it was different somehow. She'd noticed it outside but attributed it to the dim street lamp and her own cold, blurred vision. Inside, under the warm amber of the apartment lights, the feathers still had that quality. Light going in, not quite coming back out. She reached out a hand and the Raven watched her, very still, very intent, and let her touch the edge of one feather. It felt, she struggled to describe this later, when she tried to explain it to people who hadn't been there. She said it felt like touching something that existed in slightly more places than just here. She said that, and then immediately said she knew that didn't make sense, and the person she was talking to said, "You're right, that doesn't make sense," but she never came up with a better way to put it. The wing that had been at the wrong angle wasn't broken. She could see that now. It was caught. Something had snagged at the joint. Some kind of filament or thread that was nearly invisible in normal light, but that caught the kitchen lamp in a thin, silvery line. She looked at it for a long moment, then got her maintenance multi-tool from the drawer. She'd kept it from an old depot shift. Technically, it was depot property. Technically, she'd borrowed it indefinitely, and very carefully worked the tip of the thinnest blade under the filament. The Raven did not move, did not struggle, just watched her. She freed the wing in about 4 minutes. The filament, whatever it was, didn't look like any material she recognized. It was flexible but incredibly strong. She had to use the cutting edge twice before it parted. When it finally came free, the Raven rolled its shoulder in a slow, deliberate motion, extended the wing its full length, which was startling in the small kitchen, feathers brushing both sides of the counter, and then folded it back. Then it looked at her again. "You're welcome," Nadia said. She felt faintly ridiculous saying that to a bird, but it seemed right. She set out a small bowl of water. Didn't have much that a Raven might eat. She dug out half a nutrition bar that was slightly stale, broke it into pieces. The Raven ate 2 of the pieces with a kind of deliberate, measured efficiency that didn't look like hunger so much as polite acceptance. Drank a little water, then folded itself down on the dish towel and closed its eyes. Nadia watched it for a while. Then she made herself that broth, sat at the table with her knees pulled up to her chest, and watched the snow hit the window. She was asleep in her chair by 9 o'clock. When she woke up at 2 in the morning, the Raven was gone. She sat up fast, looked around the dark apartment. Her mother had come home at some point. The light under her bedroom door was the soft amber of her sleep mode lamp, and found no trace of the bird anywhere. The dish towel, the water bowl empty, the 2 remaining pieces of nutrition bar. No Raven, no feathers, no mark on the window to suggest it had gone through the glass. Just gone. Nadia sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, feeling the specific emptiness of something that had been there and then wasn't, and then went to bed. She didn't think about it much the next day. She had worked a 6-hour shift at the depot, monitoring the filtration pressure gauges on 3 of the secondary lines, and then the school learning modules she was supposed to be completing, and then the usual small life maintenance of existing in Sector 9 in the winter. She thought about it a little on Wednesday, less on Thursday. On Friday evening, there was a knock at the door. Not the automated chime of the building's visitor system, an actual knock. 2 knocks, deliberate and evenly spaced, and then nothing. Nadia's mother was home, but she'd gone to bed early with one of her headaches. The pressure fluctuations from the consortium's atmospheric field gave a lot of the older residents headaches, and her mother got them badly. Nadia was at the table with a learning module open, and she looked up at the sound and felt, without knowing why, the hair on her arm stand up. She went to the door, looked through the viewer lens. There was a girl standing in the corridor. Or something that looked like a girl. Because there was a quality to her, even through the distorting fisheye of the viewer lens, that made Nadia's brain work in two separate directions at once. One direction saying girl, yes, female person, young, and the other direction saying wait, something is different, something is not quite. She was pale, that was the first thing. Not the paleness of someone who doesn't get sun, in Sector 9, that described most people, but a paleness that had a quality to it, a kind of translucence that made you think you were looking at something that light passed through rather than reflected off. She was tall. She was wearing a coat that was too light for the weather, no thermal jacket, no collar, just a long dark coat that moved wrong in the corridor air currents, as though it was very slightly heavier than it appeared. Her hair was dark, very dark, piled loosely at the back of her head with a few strands across her face. Her eyes, even through the viewer lens, Nadia could see her eyes were unusual, a color that shifted between states as she looked at the door, not quite violet, not quite silver. Something between the two that the color vocabulary humans had developed hadn't quite gotten around to naming yet. She was looking directly at the viewer lens. Directly at it, as if she could see through it. Nadia stood very still on her side of the door. The girl on the other side said, quietly but clearly enough to carry through the insulated door panel, "I know you can see me. I'm not going to hurt you. I came to say thank you." There's a decision point in moments like this. I want you to understand the decision point because everything that came after pivoted on it. Nadia could have not opened the door. Easily. She could have said through the intercom that she had the wrong unit, or that this wasn't a good time, or nothing at all, and the girl, the whatever she was, would have eventually gone away, and Nadia's life would have continued in its established direction. She opened the door. She said later that she doesn't entirely know why. Partly it was the thank you, something in the way it was said, like it was a rare thing being offered rather than a social reflex. Partly it was the eyes, which she'd now been looking at for 40 seconds through a viewer lens and which had not blinked once. And partly, and she was honest about this, it was something in her chest that had been recognizing something since the moment she'd heard the knock. Some frequency that matched the frequency of the bird in the snow and the filament on its wing, and the way it had looked at her over 2 pieces of nutrition bar. She opened the door. The girl was even more striking in person. Up close, the translucence of her skin had a depth to it, like there was something faintly luminous underneath, just enough to notice and not enough to explain. She was a few inches taller than Nadia. She smelled faintly of something cold and clean, like air after lightning, and something else underneath that, older, stranger, without a reference point. She was looking at Nadia with those silver-violet eyes, and her expression was careful, deliberately calibrated to a kind of neutrality that Nadia would learn. This girl maintained the way other people maintain a smile. Not naturally, but with intention and practice. "The raven," the girl said. "It wasn't a question." Nadia said, "Yes." "That was mine," the girl said. "Or he was mine or I was his. It's complicated. He's old and he makes his own decisions." Nadia stood in the doorway, cold air pouring in around the girl, and said nothing, waiting. "He told me what you did," the girl said. "He has ways of communicating that don't require words. I know that sounds implausible," Nadia offered. "I was going to say difficult to explain," the girl said, and something in her expression shifted fractionally, not quite a smile but in the same neighborhood. "But implausible works." She held out one hand, palm up. Resting in it was the filament, the one Nadia had cut from the raven's wing. It sat in the girl's pale palm like a thread of frozen water, catching the corridor light and breaking it apart. "This," the girl said, "is not from this sector, not from this world actually. It's from a piece of consortium surveillance infrastructure, subdermal tethering line, used for tagging biological subjects for tracking. He was tagged 3 months ago. I've been trying to get it off him. He got it off himself with your help." Nadia looked at the filament, looked at the girl, said, "Who are you?" The girl considered the question, with the seriousness it probably deserved. "My name is Valen," she said. "I've been living in Sector 9 for about 40 years. I look like this." She made a small, precisely controlled gesture at herself. "For reasons I'll explain if you let me in, because explaining them in a corridor seems like the kind of thing that ends in someone calling a compliance monitor, and that would be inconvenient for both of us." Nadia stepped back from the door. She made tea. She wasn't sure why, it seemed like the thing to do, and having something to do with her hands helped. Valen sat at the kitchen table, her coat folded across her knees, and watched Nadia move around the small kitchen with the same quality of attention the Raven had shown. Like watching was something she did carefully, as a matter of practice. "Vampire," Nadia said, setting a cup in front of Valen and sitting across from her. Valen looked at the tea, then at Nadia. "That word has a lot of cultural luggage." "I'm familiar with the luggage," Nadia said. "Pre-contact literature had a lot of it. My mother reads historical fiction." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "But you're old, you said 40 years in this sector, which means you were here before the threshold opening, which means you predate the current governance infrastructure, which means your legal status is entirely absent," Valen said. "Yes, I exist in a gap in the records. I've become very good at that." "And the galactic soldiers?" Valen's expression did something complicated. "The consortium knows about my kind. They've known for a long time, longer than they've known about this planet. My people, we've been on Earth for centuries in various forms. When they arrived and started mapping the biosphere, we were on their inventory." "Are you on their list of regulated species?" "I'm on their list of assets to be tagged, tracked, and eventually extracted," Valen said quietly. "The filament on Selim, that's his name, the Raven, was placed there because he's been with me for almost 200 years, and tracking him is one way of tracking me." Nadia absorbed this. Outside, the snow was still going. She could hear it against the window, that soft, consistent percussion of flakes on glass. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you freed him," Valen said. "And because," she paused, and for the first time something shifted in her voice, some layer of the careful control thinning slightly. "Because the last person who did something kind for him without any expectation of return was a very long time ago, and that person mattered very much to me, and I don't have a rational explanation for why that made me want to come here. I just did." Nadia looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said, and then, because it seemed relevant, "The consortium checkpoint sweeps this week, the compliance review. Is that related?" Valen's eyes shifted. "Yes." "They're looking for you." "They're looking for something connected to me. I'm careful, but the net is getting tighter." She looked at the table. "Selim was my early warning system. When they tagged him, I lost 3 months of intelligence about their patrol patterns. That's a significant gap." Nadia was quiet for a moment. "I have access," she said slowly, "to the filtration depot's atmospheric sensor grid. Secondary level access. I'm not cleared for the primary network, but the secondary grid has passive collection from 17 sensor points across sectors 8 through 11. She paused. "I've been reading the patrol timing data for 2 years. I know the checkpoint sweep patterns for this entire zone." Valen looked at her. "I know," Nadia said. "I know I literally just met you. I know I can hear how this sounds. But the consortium's checkpoint grid cut my mother's residential permit nearly 3 years ago, and she's been on provisional status ever since, which means they can revoke her housing allocation anytime they flag something in her record. And I've been watching their patterns because I've been terrified for 2 years that one day they're going to, and I'm not going to see it coming." She set her cup down. "I see everything coming if I can. It's what I do." Valen was still looking at her. The silver-violet eyes had gone very still. "You're 17, she said. 18 in 4 months. That's not meaningfully different." "I know," Nadia said. "What's your point?" Valen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want to put you in danger." "The consortium's entire infrastructure already puts me in danger," Nadia said. "I don't need your help for that part." She picked her cup back up. "But if you want to talk about the patrol timing data for checkpoints 7 and 8, I have the last 6 weeks pulled up on my local drive." Valen looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then, very slowly, and with the air of someone doing something they had not done in a very long time, she smiled. They talked until 4 in the morning. Nadia's mother slept through all of it, which in retrospect was probably a kindness. She would have had a heart attack, and not metaphorically. What Valen explained in stages over the course of those hours reorganized everything Nadia thought she understood about the world she'd grown up in. Not the broad strokes history she knew about the contact event, the consortium's arrival, the installation of the atmospheric stabilization fields, but the layer underneath that, the part the consortium's public communication didn't address and that human historians didn't have access to. That was different. The consortium was not one entity. It was not even primarily a government. It was a resource extraction cooperative made up of 9 different species civilizations, each with their own internal politics, each with a different interest in what Earth had to offer. The atmospheric fields weren't primarily climate regulation. They were geological resource mapping infrastructure. The field's primary function was to stabilize the surface enough to allow deep subsurface scanning. They'd been mapping Earth's core mineral deposits for 60 years, building a picture of extraction value. "Which means," Nadia said slowly, "they haven't started extracting yet because they're still doing the survey." "Yes," Valen said, "and the survey has another 20-30 years before it's complete. And when it's complete, then the decision gets made about what Earth's resource profile justifies in terms of investment versus clearing cost." Clearing cost. The phrase sat there on the kitchen table between them, quiet and terrible. "How long have you known this?" Nadia asked. "I've known pieces of it for decades," Valen said. "I put the complete picture together about 12 years ago. I've spent the 12 years since then trying to build a case, documentation, evidence, the kind of material that could be presented to the consortium's internal oversight bodies, because they do have oversight bodies. They're just buried under 7 layers of administrative language." "Why oversight bodies? Why not, I don't know, warning people, telling humans what's actually happening?" "Warning humans would cause panic without providing options," Valen said. "Humans can't stop the consortium militarily. You know that. Anyone who's thought honestly about the power differential knows that. But the consortium's internal governance structures have provisions. There are species protection protocols, habitat conservation frameworks, and most relevantly, a first contact ethics review process that can be triggered if you can demonstrate that a pre-contact intelligent species is being systematically misled about the terms of its integration." She paused. "The key word is demonstrate. You need evidence. Documented, cross-referenced, source-verified evidence from multiple independent sources. And Selim is one of your sources. Selim can go places I can't. He can access areas of consortium infrastructure that are shielded against me. Certain frequencies interfere with my ability to move undetected, and those frequencies are concentrated around their data centers." She looked at the raven's former perch on the dish towel. "He's been collecting for 3 months, or he was, until they tagged him and I had to pull him from active collection." "But now the tag is off," Nadia said. "Now the tag is off." They looked at each other across the small kitchen table, in the pre-dawn quiet of a small apartment in Sector 9, with snow still falling outside and the weight of what they were talking about pressing down on the air between them. "I want to help," Nadia said. I know, Valen said. That's what I'm afraid of. Let me tell you something about fear, because it matters here. Valen was almost 250 years old. She'd seen things that would have broken most minds. She'd watched centuries of human history from a particular angle, the angle of someone who was part of it and also slightly outside it, close enough to feel everything and different enough to survive it. She'd lost people, enormous numbers of people. She'd built things and watched them collapse. She'd learned over 2 centuries how to calibrate her own fear, to recognize when it was useful information, and when it was just the weight of accumulated loss making her hesitate. But there was a specific fear she still hadn't learned to work around, and it was the fear of being responsible for someone young and capable and full of potential getting hurt, because she'd pulled them into something larger than their own life. She sat with that fear in Nadia's kitchen at 4 in the morning and looked at this 17-year-old who had access to 17 atmospheric sensor points and 6 weeks of checkpoint timing data, and the specific, focused kind of intelligence that knows the difference between watching and understanding. She thought about the last person who had done something for Selim without expecting anything in return. She thought about what the survey completion meant, and what came after it, and what it would mean to do nothing. She looked at Nadia. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and then I'm going to ask you to think about it for at least 24 hours before you give me an answer, because once you're in this, there are things I can do to keep you safe, but I can't make guarantees. The consortium has resources that—" "I know what the consortium has," Nadia said, "not sharp, not aggressive, just clear. I've been living inside their resource allocation for 17 years. I know exactly what they have." She met Valen's eyes. "Tell me what you need." Valen was quiet for a long moment. Then she told her. What Valen needed was a relay point. She explained it carefully, methodically, the way she'd clearly thought through operational security for a long time. She needed a physical location, human-occupied, in a human residential zone, with nothing on its compliance record to attract attention, that could serve as a data aggregation point. The evidence she was building needed to pass through human-controlled infrastructure at least once in its chain, because consortium oversight bodies conducting a first contact ethics review were required, under their own protocols, to accept evidence sourced from members of the species in question. It couldn't just be external documentation. It had to include testimony and data collected by humans. "You're not just looking for a relay point," Nadia said. "You're looking for a human source, a named, documented, traceable human source who can be cited in an oversight review." "Yes," Valen said. "Which means I'd be on record." "Yes." Nadia looked at her. "I told you to think about it for 24 hours, Valen said. "I don't need 24 hours, Nadia said. "I needed to understand what I was actually agreeing to." She paused. "You're building a case for a review process that could theoretically protect Earth, and you need a human to stand up and be the source." Simplified, yes. "And if the review fails, then having a named human source in the documentation increases the risk to that person. Yes, I'm not going to soften that." Nadia was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow was finally starting to thin. She could see the darker shapes of the tower blocks through the window, the blue-white of their upper lights just beginning to be visible as the snowfall lightened. "My mother," she said, "if something happens to me, or if my record gets flagged through this, what happens to her provisional housing status?" Valen looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and set something on the table, a small data chip, matte silver, about the size of a thumbnail. "That," she said, "is a residential legitimacy document encoded in consortium administrative format that establishes full permanent residential status for the occupant of Unit 602, Block 14C, Sector 9. She paused. "It took me 8 years to generate it cleanly enough to pass an audit. I was going to use it as a trade piece eventually. But she paused. Your mother helped someone once before you were born. I was there. She doesn't know I was there, and I don't think she remembers the incident clearly. But I do. Nadia looked at the chip. Looked at Valen. You've been watching out for us, she said slowly. I watch out for a lot of people, Valen said carefully. I've had a lot of time. There are networks, there are records, people who matter for various reasons. Why does my mother matter? Valen was quiet for a moment. She was kind to someone I loved, she said finally. A long time ago, that's all. Nadia picked up the chip, turned it over in her fingers, set it back on the table but did not push it back. I'm in, she said. Valen looked at her. Get some sleep, Nadia said. You look, she paused, because you didn't generally tell a vampire they looked tired, like someone who has been running for a long time. Valen looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said quietly, I have been. She didn't sleep there, she wouldn't explain exactly where she went. Not then, not yet, but she came back the next evening. And the evening after that. By the end of the second week, there was a pattern. Valen came after dark, when Nadia's mother had gone to bed. They sat at the kitchen table with Nadia's local drive open, the atmospheric sensor data pulled up, and they worked. Nadia would walk her through the patrol timing analysis she'd been building for 2 years. The gaps in the checkpoint sweeps, the windows of reduced coverage, the rhythms of the galactic soldier patrols that were as mechanical in their predictability as any other scheduled infrastructure system. Valen would overlay information from her own sources. Selim's reconnaissance data, which came in through a method Nadia still didn't entirely understand, but that translated into specific geolocated signal intercepts. Contacts Valen had in other sectors who fed her pieces of the larger picture. The picture was building. Slowly, carefully, piece by piece, the way a mosaic comes together, individual fragments that look like nothing on their own, accumulating into something that could eventually be understood as a whole. Nadia's mother noticed she was sleeping less, said so, with that particular maternal tone that communicates worry without specifying it. Nadia said she was deep in a learning module, technically not untrue, since the atmospheric sensor analysis was the most intensive learning experience of her life. Her mother looked at her with the complicated eyes of a parent who suspects more than they know and is deciding how much they want to know. She didn't push. On the 23rd day of their working arrangement, Selim reappeared. He came in through the window. Nadia had started leaving it cracked an inch, without admitting to herself that was what she was doing, and settled on the back of the chair across from her while she was eating breakfast alone. He sat there and watched her with his strange, focused intelligence, and when she set a piece of nutrition bar on the table, he ate it with that same measured, deliberate efficiency he'd shown the first night. He likes you, Valen said that evening when Nadia mentioned it. He evaluates me, Nadia said. There's a difference. Valen almost smiled. With him, those things are the same. 3 days after Selim came back, something changed in the patrol patterns. Nadia saw it first. She'd been staring at the sensor data long enough that the rhythm of it was part of her peripheral awareness, something she clocked automatically the way you clock the sound of your own building's elevator. A shift in the checkpoint 7 sweep timing. Small, 11 minutes, not enough to be obvious, but consistent across 3 consecutive days. A narrowing. They're contracting the sweep radius, she said, pulling the data onto the display and pointing to the pattern. Look, here, here, and here. They're not moving to more checkpoints. They're compressing the existing coverage toward a center point. Valen leaned over her shoulder, studying the display. She was close enough that Nadia could feel the particular quality of her proximity, not temperature exactly, because Valen ran cooler than human normal in most circumstances, but something like presence, a density of attention. The center point, Valen said quietly. Where does the compression point to? Nadia ran the calculation, looked at the result, looked at Valen. "Here," she said, "2 blocks this sector." Silence. "They know," Nadia said. "They suspect," Valen said, and her voice was steady but something under it wasn't. "There's a difference. Suspicion requires resource commitment to confirm. They'll tighten the net before they commit to an enforcement action. They need certainty before they move, because enforcement actions against a non-cataloged entity in a residential zone require a full consortium logistics sign-off, and those take time." "How much time?" Valen looked at the patrol data, at the compression pattern, at Nadia. 4 days, she said, maybe 5. Nadia looked at the data, at 4 weeks of accumulated evidence files on her local drive. At the small matte silver chip her mother's housing document was encoded on, which was currently secured in the sealed utility alcove behind the environmental regulators. She looked at Valen. "Tell me," she said, "what happens if we submit what we have now, incomplete? What we have so far, is it enough to trigger a preliminary review, to get the process started?" Valen was quiet for a long moment. "A preliminary submission," she said slowly. "It would require the evidence to be flagged as partial, with a declared intent to supplement, which means the review would open but not fully begin. It would sit in preliminary status while we continued building the case." She paused. "But a preliminary submission would also generate an administrative record, which means my name would be on file with the oversight bodies. Which means enforcement action against me would require consortium internal approval, rather than just local galactic soldier sign-off." "That changes the risk calculus," Nadia said. "Significantly," Valen agreed. "Can you get the preliminary submission out in 4 days?" Valen looked at her, at the accumulated evidence, at the girl across the table who was 17 years old and had spent 2 years building a surveillance pattern map out of atmospheric sensor data because she was afraid for her mother and wanted to see everything coming. "Yes," she said. "Then let's do it," Nadia said. She reached across and turned the display to the full evidence file view, everything they'd built together over 4 weeks. Weeks of nights and whispered conversation, and a raven on a chair back and tea gone cold while they worked. "Let's show them what we have," she said. 4 days. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 4 days. In the abstract, that sounds like enough time. 4 days to compile, organize, and transmit a partial evidence submission to the consortium's internal oversight architecture. 4 days while the patrol sweep pattern compressed toward their sector like a closing hand. 4 days while Nadia's mother went to work at the depot and came home and warmed soup and asked about the learning modules and didn't know. 4 days feels like a lot until it's happening in real time. The first day was the easiest, relatively. Valen arrived at the apartment before dark that day, which was the first time she'd broken the established pattern. She knocked with the same 2 deliberate knocks, and Nadia opened the door and noted the early hour, and Valen said, "I need us to start now," and Nadia simply stepped back and let her in. They spent that day, the full day, from late afternoon until past 3 in the morning, going through the accumulated evidence file and building the submission structure. The consortium's oversight protocol required a specific organizational format. Each piece of evidence assigned a classification code, each code linked to a corresponding provision in the first contact ethics review framework, each link annotated with source verification. It was meticulous, painstaking work, the kind of work that requires a particular combination of concentration and patience, and Valen had the patience of centuries and Nadia had a mind built for pattern finding, and together they were something more effective than either alone. Selim sat on his chair back and watched them work. Occasionally he moved, a short flight from the chair to the window ledge and back, but mostly he was still, his strange light-absorbing black presence in the corner of the room like a piece of deep sky that had come inside. Nadia's mother came home at midnight, looked at the kitchen, saw Valen at the table and stopped. She was not a panicking person. She had not made it through the post-contact decades as a single parent by being a panicking person. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Valen, at the translucent pallor and the unusual eyes and the quality of her stillness, and then looked at Nadia, and then looked at the raven on the chair back, and then said very calmly, "Is there tea?" "Yes," Nadia said. "Good." Her mother set her bag down and came to the table and sat in the third chair, and Valen looked at her across the accumulated evidence files, and Nadia's mother looked back, and then she said, "You were outside the Old Quarter Medical Exchange. 2258. There was a girl." "Clara," Valen said. Her voice was very quiet. "Yes." Nadia's mother looked at her for a long moment. "She lived," her mother said, "because of what you did." "She would have managed," Valen said. "She wouldn't have," her mother said simply. "I know what I saw." She looked at the evidence files on the display, at the documents and data and the careful, organized months of accumulated truth. "Tell me what you need." Nadia's mother's name was Petra. I want to say that clearly because she deserves to be named. Petra Voss, 44 years old in 2287. Depot maintenance technician, primary atmospheric filtration sector. Post-contact native, which meant she'd grown up in the transition years, old enough to remember before the consortium arrived, young enough to have adapted. She had the particular resilience of people who survive by understanding exactly what they're surviving, without flinching from it. She sat down with them that night and she became the third point in the architecture they were building. Her depot access, primary level, as a senior technician, extended to atmospheric monitoring nodes that Nadia's secondary access didn't reach. She had 6 years of environmental variance logs stored on her work drive that documented systematic anomalies in the stabilization field that were consistent with the subsurface mapping signals Valen had been intercepting. 6 years of professional documentation, properly time-stamped, source verified, carrying the weight of a senior technician's record. "This," Valen said, looking at the first of the variance logs, "this is the piece I've been missing, the internal human documentation of the field anomalies." "I noted them every time," Petra said. "I filed the anomaly reports through proper channels. They were received and closed without action every single time. I kept my copies." "You kept them for a reason," Nadia said. Her mother looked at her. "I kept them because I've been watching the patterns for 6 years, and I knew something was wrong, and I wanted evidence in case I ever found someone who knew what to do with it." The three of them looked at each other across the kitchen table. "We should have been talking years ago," Nadia said. "Yes," Petra said dryly, "we probably should have been." The second day. The second day was harder because the patrol compression continued. Nadia was monitoring the sensor data constantly now. She'd rigged a passive alert on her personal device that flagged any timing variation in the checkpoint sweep data, and the pattern was contracting on schedule. By the end of day 2, the center of the compression was identifiable with a margin of error of about 4 blocks. They were in the middle of it. Valen was careful. She moved differently during the day hours in those 4 days, not where she went, which Nadia still didn't fully know, but how she moved when she arrived and left. The specific routes. The timing. She'd spent 40 years surviving in Sector 9 by understanding the galactic soldier's detection range, and she was running every bit of that expertise. But there was a new element in the patrol pattern that Nadia flagged on the morning of day 2, reviewing the overnight sensor logs. A secondary sweep team. Not one of the established 8-limbed galactic soldier units. Those had a distinctive atmospheric signature that read clearly on the filtration sensors. This was something different. A finer-grained signal, harder to isolate, that appeared in the data as interference rather than a clear spike. She showed it to Valen that evening. Valen looked at it for a long time. Tracker units, she said finally, different from the standard patrol soldiers. These are specialized, they're built for biological entity location. They work at a shorter range but with much higher precision. She looked at the interference pattern. They're not looking for me specifically yet. They're doing pre-enforcement mapping, building a location profile before they commit. She paused. This is them being thorough. How do they track? Nadia asked. Residual biosignature, Valen said. Everyone who exists leaves a trace, metabolic output, electromagnetic variation. Mine is different from human. It doesn't decay the way human signatures do. It persists in spaces I've occupied. She looked at the kitchen. This apartment. Petra was standing at the window, looking out at the falling snow. How long does it persist? In an enclosed space with regular human occupation, the human signatures overlay and partially mask mine. But if they scanned specifically for the variance markers, they'd find it. She looked at Nadia. They'd find it here. Silence. Then we need to finish and get the submission out before they narrow it further, Nadia said. Yes. How's the compilation? 70% complete. The formatting is the slow part. The oversight protocol has very specific requirements, and I won't submit something that gets rejected on a technicality. What can I do to speed it up? Valen showed her. Nadia learned the oversight protocol format in approximately 4 hours, which Valen found impressive enough to say so. Nadia did not find it particularly impressive. To her, it looked like a more complex version of the compliance report structure she'd been reading at the depot for 2 years, and the logic of it wasn't very different once you understood the underlying framework. You adapt fast, Valen said. I have to, Nadia said simply. Everyone in Sector 9 adapts fast. It's not a choice. Valen was quiet for a moment. No, she said, I know. I'm sorry. It was the first time Nadia had heard her apologize for something that wasn't directly within her power to have done differently. It landed differently than she expected, not as a courtesy phrase, but as something heavier. The weight of centuries of watching people have to adapt to things that should not have required adaptation. They kept working. The third day. Day 3 brought 2 things. The first was that Selim came back from a reconnaissance run. He was going out now, in short loops, careful distances, carrying a modified collection unit that Valen had built into a small band around one leg that was nearly invisible against the feather line. The data he brought back, translated through the relay that sat on the corner of Nadia's desk, filled in 3 specific gaps in the evidence file that had been marked as pending verification. 3 gaps closed. The submission's factual architecture became significantly more complete. The second thing was that a consortium compliance notice arrived at Block 14C. Not at Unit 602 specifically. At the building management level, delivered to the automated building systems, logged in the resident notification queue. Nadia caught it on the building's shared information board when she went down to check the mail slot. A standard format notice about a residential zone atmospheric survey, scheduled for the following week, requiring all residents to ensure proper documentation was on file and accessible for review. She read it twice, went back upstairs. Told Valen. Valen's expression did not change, but something behind it did, a subtle shift, like a landscape adjusting in the weather. Atmospheric survey is the civilian language term for a biosignature sweep, she said. I know, Nadia said. I figured. Next week gives us an extra few days of margin, technically, Nadia said. But it also tells us they're planning to do this through official administrative channels. Which means they've already decided where they think you are. They're just preparing the paperwork. Which is actually useful information, Petra said from the doorway. She'd taken a personal day from the depot, the first personal day she'd taken in 11 months. because administrative channels move on predictable timelines. Yes, Valen said, looking at her, they do. How much of the submission is done? 85%. Then we push tonight and finish it, Petra said. All three of us, all night if we have to. She went to the kitchen and started making coffee, real coffee, a tin she kept for significant occasions, slightly stale because significant occasions were rare, but real. They worked all night. What they were building, I want to make sure I explain this clearly, because it's important and the summary version doesn't do justice to the reality. The first contact ethics review framework existed because the consortium, despite being an extractive economic cooperative at its core, had been built by species who had, at various points in their own histories, been on the receiving end of exactly what they were now doing to Earth. The oversight provisions were real. They had been invoked before, in 2 cases in the consortium's 3,000-year institutional history. Once for a pre-contact world in what humans would call the Andromeda constellation, whose atmospheric resources were being surveilled for extraction before its dominant species had been informed, and once for a deep ocean civilization that had been progressively relocated from its native habitat through infrastructure development without disclosure. Both reviews had resulted in protective reclassification. The affected worlds were now listed as treaty habitats under consortium internal law, which didn't prevent all resource engagement but required full disclosure, negotiated consent, and protected zones. The case Valen had been building for 12 years was, at its core, an argument that Earth qualified for the same review process, that the human species had been integrated into consortium administrative infrastructure without disclosure of the actual terms. Specifically, without disclosure that the atmospheric stabilization fields served primary resource mapping functions, and without disclosure of the extraction assessment that would follow the survey's completion. The preliminary submission didn't need to prove the whole case. It needed to demonstrate that there was a credible, sufficiently documented claim to justify opening the full review process, and it needed human testimony, named, on record. At 4 in the morning on the 3rd day, or the beginning of the 4th, Valen finished the final section of the submission document. She pushed it across the display to Nadia, who read it carefully, and then to Petra, who read it more slowly, pausing on certain lines with the expression of someone recognizing something they'd known for a long time being spoken aloud for the first time. At the bottom of the document, there was a signature field. The oversight protocol required a named human signatory, someone taking formal responsibility for the testimony components of the submission. Petra picked up the stylus without hesitating. She signed. Nadia signed below her. Valen looked at both signatures. Something in her face, in those silver-violet eyes, shifted, and for the first time in Nadia's observation of her, she looked her age. Not physically, but in some quality of her expression, some depth of something that came up through 250 years of watching and waiting and building towards something she wasn't sure would ever actually happen. "Thank you," she said. It was the same phrase she'd used at the door 2 months ago, but it wasn't the same phrase. The transmission. Valen had the relay architecture planned, had had it planned for years, waiting for the submission to be complete enough to send. It couldn't go through any human-operated network, because all human networks in the consortium-governed zones were monitored. It couldn't go through consortium-controlled infrastructure for obvious reasons. What it could go through was the old deep space communication relay array that the pre-contact era space agencies had deployed in the outer system, relics of the pre-contact period, still technically operational, that the consortium had cataloged and noted, and then deprioritized as obsolete human technology not worth integrating. They'd been sitting there, quietly functional for 80 years. Valen had a connection to one of them. She'd built it, carefully and incrementally, over 30 years of work. The relay could get a signal to the outer system, and from there to a consortium navigation beacon, and from there, through a route she'd mapped over a decade, to the administrative registry of the Ethics Review Oversight Office. The transmission itself would take about 11 minutes. The receipt confirmation would come back in approximately 6 hours if the routing worked. And if it doesn't work, Nadia asked. Then we reroute and try again, Valen said. The relay array has 17 nodes. I know 3 alternative paths. How long have you been planning this? Which part? All of it, the whole thing. The evidence, the submission, the relay, all of it. Valen looked at her. 12 years since I put the complete picture together. The relay architecture took another 3 years. Some of the evidence collection predates even that. The variance pattern tracking Selim has been doing in one form or another for almost 20 years. Nadia absorbed that. You've been doing this for 20 years and I've been alive for 17. Yes. And you were just waiting for what? Valen looked at the completed submission on the display. For it to be ready. For the evidence to be dense enough that a rejection on insufficient grounds became very difficult. For a human source who wasn't going to be intimidated into withdrawing. She paused. For the right people to exist. Nadia looked at her for a long moment. You were waiting for us, she said. Specifically. I wasn't waiting specifically for you, Valen said carefully. But I was waiting for someone like you. She paused again. Though I should say, I've been keeping an eye on your mother's situation for 8 years, so perhaps specifically is not entirely wrong. Petra, from across the table, made a sound that in a less extraordinary situation would have been laughter. They transmitted at dawn. The patrol data showed the sweep compression at its tightest before the structured enforcement window, the period between 4 and 7 in the morning, when the galactic soldier units rotated between shift cycles. The atmospheric sensor data showed a 17-minute window of reduced signature detection capability in the Sector 9 core zone. They sent it in the middle of that window. All 3 of them sat at the table and watched the transmission status indicator on Valen's relay interface, a piece of technology that looked, externally, like an ordinary atmospheric sensor housing, a type of equipment nobody looked twice at in a filtration sector, and watched the progress increment. 3%, 7:15. Outside, the snow had stopped. That happened sometimes, even in the stabilized zone, a few hours of stillness, the sky a pale gray-white that wasn't quite dawn and wasn't quite night. Selim sat on the window ledge, looking out at it, very still. 40%, 55. Petra made more coffee, set cups in front of all of them. Valen accepted hers. She didn't drink coffee exactly, but she held the cup. And Nadia had noticed that she did this sometimes, held warm things, and had decided not to ask about it because it seemed like a personal thing. 70%. What happens if the patrol closes in before the confirmation comes back? Nadia asked. The submission is already sent, Valen said. The receipt is procedural, it confirms the pathway worked. The submission itself is in transit. Even if they close in now, the submission is already in the queue. But you? Yes, Valen said. 90%. Nadia looked at her. What do you need to be safe, physically, while we wait for the confirmation? Where do you go? There are places, Valen said. I've been managing this for 40 years. But the tracker units are different from the standard patrol. You said so. Yes. So the places that worked for 40 years might not be sufficient for the tracker units. Valen was quiet. Where is safe? Nadia asked. Actually safe. Nowhere in Sector 9, now that they've done the preliminary mapping, Valen said. The tracker units work on the residual biosignature overlap pattern. Every place I've spent significant time is compromised. I'd need to move to a location where my signature hasn't established a baseline. Somewhere you've never been. Yes. 98%. There's a location, Petra said slowly, in the sub-level maintenance network. Below the depot, there are sealed sections from the original infrastructure build that are completely off the active systems grid. They haven't been accessed in 12 years. No one goes there. No sensors. Valen looked at her. I know about them because I maintain the hatches, Petra said. It's technically depot property, but it's been administratively orphaned. The oversight records show it as decommissioned space. She paused. No sensors, no activity logs, no baseline signature on file anywhere. 100%, transmission complete. They all looked at the indicator. The kitchen was very quiet. Selim turned from the window and looked at all three of them. Okay, Nadia said. She exhaled slowly. Okay. The 6 hours waiting for confirmation were the longest 6 hours of Nadia's life. She slept for 2 of them, on the kitchen floor, which was not comfortable, but she was tired enough that it didn't matter. She woke up to Selim standing very close to her head, looking at her with those focused amber eyes, and she lay there for a moment looking at the ceiling and thinking about the fact that she had just put her name on a document that was currently traveling through the outer solar system toward an alien administrative registry. She was 18 in 4 months. She thought that was funny briefly, in the specific dark comedy way that things become funny when they're too large to process as serious. She sat up. Valen was at the table, the relay interface in front of her still. Petra was asleep in her chair. She'd finally stopped arguing about staying awake, an hour before. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments get before sunrise, the particular stillness of a space that contains sleeping people. Nadia made herself tea, sat across from Valen. Tell me something, she said quietly, about before, whatever you want to tell me. Valen looked at her. Why, she asked. Because I want to know you, Nadia said simply. Not just what you need and what you're trying to do, you. Valen was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to talk, not about tactics or evidence or the consortium or the review process. About a winter in St. Petersburg in 1843, and a woman who taught her to play a particular piece on the fortepiano that she'd never entirely forgotten. About the year she'd spent in a fishing village in what is now called Indonesia, in the 1700s, learning to navigate by the stars with a man who knew 17 different names for the color of the pre-storm ocean. About Selim, how they'd found each other in a coastal city that no longer existed, in a winter that was nothing like this one, and how he'd simply decided to follow her home one evening and hadn't stopped. She talked quietly, and Nadia listened, and the tea got cold, and outside the sky began to shift from gray-white toward the pale silver-gray that passed for dawn in the stabilized zone. At 6 hours and 12 minutes, the confirmation came through. They all looked at it. Petra had woken with the soft alert chime, and she was standing behind Nadia's chair, both hands on Nadia's shoulders, reading the words on the display. Protocol 8.3. Valen had mentioned that provision. It was one of the administrative triggers they'd been hoping to hit. An applicant protection hold meant that enforcement action against any named party in an active first contact review required consortium-level approval rather than local administrative authorization. The bureaucratic barrier was enormous. It wouldn't last forever. The review itself was the ongoing protection mechanism, but it created immediate space. Is this real? Nadia asked. Yes, Valen said. Her voice was different. Not less controlled, exactly, but with something present in it that hadn't been there before. Something that might have been relief, after 12 years, finally allowed to exist in her voice without being managed away. What happens now? Petra asked. Now, Valen said, the Oversight Office sends a preliminary inquiry team to verify the evidence. That process takes approximately 6 months. During those 6 months, they'll ask for supplementary documentation, which means we keep building. The preliminary inquiry doesn't stop the survey, but it flags the case for administrative review, which means any extraction decision made before the review concludes is challengeable under consortium internal law. She paused. It's not over. It's far from over. But it started. That's enough, Petra said. Yes, Valen said, that's enough. The Galactic Soldier Patrol completed its compression sweep of the Sector 9 core zone on Day 5. They found elevated biosignature variants consistent with a non-catalogued entity presence in 3 residential blocks. They filed an enforcement request with local consortium administration. The enforcement request was automatically flagged against Case File 77 XCTA Human 01, Protocol 8.3. It was forwarded to consortium-level review. The review timeline was standard, 90 days minimum before local enforcement action could proceed. In 90 days, a lot could happen. In 90 days, the preliminary inquiry team would already be active. Valen spent the following week in the sealed maintenance sections below the depot, the ones Petra knew and maintained and had access to, the ones with no baseline signature and no active monitoring. She was still close enough to work, still connected through the relay. Selim went back and forth between the sublevels and Nadia's kitchen window with the comfortable regularity of a commuter. On a Thursday evening, about 10 days after the transmission, Nadia came down to the sublevel maintenance section with a thermos of tea and a freshly pulled data report from the atmospheric sensor grid, and sat on the floor next to where Valen was working on the supplementary documentation framework. You know, she said, handing over the thermos, there are better places to work than abandoned sublevel maintenance sections. Name one that also has complete freedom from biosignature monitoring infrastructure, Valen said. Fair, Nadia said. She spread the sensor data report on the floor between them. Patrol patterns have shifted. Look at this. The compression has reversed. They're expanding the sweep radius. I think the enforcement hold has made them reconfigure. Valen looked at the data. Yes, they're recalibrating. They're not abandoning the search. They're just having to adjust their approach within the administrative constraints. She studied the pattern. This is actually useful. An expanded sweep radius is less precise. Less precise is safer for you. Less precise is safer for me, she agreed. They sat in the sublevel maintenance section, with the thermos between them and the sensor data spread on the floor and Selim on a pipe overhead, and worked. There's a kind of partnership that forms between people who work toward the same difficult thing over enough time. It doesn't always look the way partnerships are supposed to look. It's not always warm in the conventional sense, not always comfortable, not always well-defined. Sometimes it looks like 2 people sitting on a cold concrete floor in an abandoned maintenance section, reviewing atmospheric sensor data together in the middle of the night. Sometimes it looks like a raven going back and forth between 2 locations carrying data, choosing this arrangement of his own free will. Sometimes it looks like a mother signing her name to a document that could upend everything, because she'd watched the sky change for 40 years and it was time. The supplementary documentation grew. Week by week, the evidence archive deepened. The preliminary inquiry team made first contact, a secure administrative communication, routed through the Ethics Review Office, requesting specific additional evidence categories. They answered each request methodically. Nadia's sensor data, Petra's variance logs, Selim's intercepts translated and formatted, Valen's decades of cross-reference documentation. The Galactic Soldier Patrols continued in Sector 9. The checkpoint sweeps continued. The atmospheric stabilization fields continued to hum at their particular frequency, doing their subsurface mapping work. Life in Sector 9 continued, cold and tight and provisional, the way it had always been, with people navigating a world that had been reshaped around priorities that weren't theirs. But something was different now. Something was in process. Something with Nadia's name on it, and her mother's name, was sitting in the administrative records of a body that had the institutional authority to change what happened here. That could, if everything went right, shift the terms of Earth's position within the consortium framework. Not overnight. Not without continued work, and continued risk, and continued careful building of a case that had to be airtight to survive the scrutiny it would face. But started, legitimately, officially, procedurally started, in a way that could not be simply erased. 2 months after the transmission, Nadia was on her way back from the depot, the short way, through Checkpoint 7, because the patrol patterns had shifted enough that it was safe again, and she stopped at the base of the lamp post in Meridian Passage. The snow had frozen hard around the base of it overnight. She stood there and looked at the ground where the Raven had been, that Tuesday in February. The place where she'd almost stepped on something small and cold and alive and decided, without fully deciding, to be involved. She heard the wing before she saw it, that soft rush of air that large birds displace. And then Selim landed on the lamp post above her, talons closing on the metal with a sound like a firm handshake. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Hello," she said. He looked at her with his focused amber intelligence, the light going into his feathers and not entirely coming back. He clicked his beak once, a single deliberate sound. She thought, for no reason she could explain, that it was the Raven's equivalent of yes. Valen came back to the apartment on the first evening of spring, or what passed for spring in the stabilized zone, which was the point where the temperature climbed to +2, and the snow became slush, and the sky went from white to a pale, tentative gray-blue. She knocked twice, evenly spaced. Nadia opened the door. They looked at each other. "Come in," Nadia said. "My mother made soup." Valen looked at her for a moment. That something that wasn't quite a smile played at the corner of her expression. "Real soup?" she asked. "From actual vegetables," Nadia confirmed. "She found a market 2 sectors over." Valen came in. The apartment was warm, and Selim was on the chair back, and Petra was in the kitchen with the windows slightly open, because the first almost warm day of the year deserved to be noticed. And 3 people, one of them not quite people in the conventional taxonomic sense, but in every way that counted, sat around a small table in a small apartment in Sector 9 and ate soup, and reviewed preliminary inquiry team correspondence, and talked about what came next. What came next was uncertain. The review was in process but far from complete. The consortium's administrative machinery moved with the speed of institutional entities everywhere, slowly, methodically, with frequent requests for clarification and supplementary documentation. The enforcement hold on Valen's case was active but not permanent. The galactic soldiers were still in Sector 9, still running their checkpoints, still doing the survey work their presence here had always actually been about. None of that had changed. Most of it wouldn't change quickly. But the submission was on file. The names were on it. The evidence was documented, organized, cross-referenced, and growing. And the process had started, the legitimate, institutional, can't-simply-be-erased process that was the only mechanism that actually had a chance. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Here is what I want you to take away from this, if you take away anything at all. Nadia Vaz was 17 years old. She was walking home from work on a cold Tuesday in February, trying not to lose feeling in her fingers, and she saw a bird lying in the snow and she did something about it. She didn't decide to change the world. She decided not to keep walking. That's a smaller thing and also a larger one. The world she lived in was enormous and cold, and run by forces that had been operating on longer timelines than human civilization, with resources that dwarfed anything humans had been able to build, with interests that were not, in any obvious sense, aligned with human ones. That is not a small thing to be up against. That is possibly the largest thing humans have ever been up against. And the answer to it wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a military capability or a technological breakthrough or a single dramatic moment of defiance against overwhelming force. It was a 17-year-old with 2 years of atmospheric sensor data and the instinct to see patterns in systems. And her mother with 11 months of variance logs she'd never stopped filing even though no one ever acted on them. And a woman who had been alive for 250 years and had been building a case for 12 of them. And a raven who had been carrying data in the dark for 20 years. It was people being careful and stubborn and not looking away from things that were difficult to look at. It was a girl in the snow crouching down. It was a door opened. It was tea made, because that's something you do when you're facing something large. You make something warm and you hold it and you keep going. That's all, that's what it was. And somewhere in the outer solar system, in the administrative records of a body that had the authority to reshape what happened to this planet and the people on it, there were 2 names on a document and a case file with a number and a status that said, open. Not won, not finished, not safe, but open. And in a world where powerful forces have spent a very long time trying to ensure that nothing opens, that the terms are already set, that the timeline is already fixed, that the outcome is already determined before the people most affected by it have any idea what's actually happening, open is where everything starts. That was the year everything changed for Nadia Voss. She didn't know it yet, not completely. She knew pieces of it. She could see the pattern, as she always could see patterns, could feel the shape of what was happening and what it might lead to. But the full weight of it would take years to become clear, and some of it would be hard, and some of it would be frightening, and some of it would be the kind of difficult that doesn't resolve into a lesson, that just sits there as something you carry. But she would carry it. She'd already shown she could carry things, a bird under a thermal jacket in the snow, all the way home, not knowing what she was starting. That's usually how it works. You never know what you're starting. You just decide not to keep walking.